Welcome back to OpenLine. I hope you're learning as much as I am tonight. This has just been a fascinating conversation with Howard Cattell from the President and CEO of the Hermitage, talking about Andrew Jackson. He's moving to the back of the 20 bill. Harriet Tubman will be pictured on the front, but this change isn't going to happen, even though it's just announced. It's not going to happen until about the year 2030, as well as changes to the $5 and $10 bill as well. But we want to talk more about Andrew Jackson. By the way, your phone calls are always welcome. Your thoughts, comments on these changes to our currency. But in the meantime, if we do get any of those calls, in the meantime, let's talk about firsts in Andrew Jackson's presidential career.
Okay. Well, we did touch upon Jackson being the first son of an immigrant. The first president not from Virginia or Massachusetts. He was the first president who was he was seen by the majority of Americans as the guy representing the common man.
Yeah, he was the people's man.
He was the people's man, and he was the first president of that ilk, if you will. He was also the first president who pushed back vehemently with Congress, saying that the office of the president was co-equal with Congress and the Supreme Court, so that the president wasn't just implementing what Congress directed, but Jackson was pushing Congress to do what he felt was right and managing what Congress directed him to do. So there was a real push-pull between he and Congress in a lot of ways. He was the first president to ride on a train.
Wow.
Which I thought was very cool. I'm a train guy. I love trains. He was the first president to finish the White House. There were a lot of firsts during that time, and I think an important thing to remember is the 1820s, 1830s was a time of tremendous ferment in this country, and in many ways was changing as rapidly and profoundly as we are as a nation today.
As you were saying, a lot of optimism, but also a lot of unrest, and that's something that we can all identify with right now. But how back then?
Very much so. The Industrial Revolution was just, bad pun, building up ahead of steam. but steam-powered engines were becoming far more prevalent. So you had trains and you had steamboats, and so transportation, the speed of transportation was starting to increase markedly. The ability to print newspapers, the communications was exploding. So suddenly, small towns that didn't necessarily ever have a newspaper before, or you waited weeks to find out, news was far more readily available more quickly. And not unlike the internet today, one newspaper would write a story and another newspaper would pick it up, and then another newspaper would pick it up. So the news was more common, more commonly shared. The economy was changing. It was the age of the rising of corporations, where before you had a couple of people running a business, or that could be very lucrative, but suddenly you had people banding together to create corporations with a lot of power.
Wow.
And that was something that the average citizen was nervous about, and that was something that Jackson was very focused on, concerned about, that corporations not have so much power that they manipulate government to the disadvantage of the average citizen.
Where does the Hermitage come in Andrew Jackson's story?
He and his wife Rachel purchased the Hermitage in 1804. And when they bought it, it was a 425-acre farm, and they moved into a 2-story log farmhouse with some other outbuildings, and they begin to develop it right away. So his wife Rachel died in 1828, about 2 weeks after he was elected president, but before he was inaugurated. So technically, she was never First Lady.
Wow.
He wasn't. Then the inauguration was in March. But Jackson continues to live there until 1845, when he dies. So it was his home for 41 years. He had owned 2 other plantations before this. His adopted son, Andrew Jackson Jr., lived there until his death. And then his grandson lived there with his family until 1893.
Wow.
So the interesting point, though, is that the Hermitage became a museum 4 years before that. So there was an overlapping time period where the first floor of the mansion was a museum, and the family lived upstairs. And then
That is interesting.
they left and moved to Ohio.
Very interesting indeed. Tell me a little bit more about his personal life. Obviously, he had some sorrow there with his wife dying even before he took office. Adopted son.
His wife, he and his wife Rachel were married twice. They had a somewhat rocky beginning to their life. That was a major part of the Jackson story. That when she married him, she had already been married once. She married as a 16-year-old girl, which was typical back then, and it was an unhappy relationship. Eventually, she returns to her mother. They get word that her husband had divorced her.
Oh.
And divorce was complicated back then, and only a man could divorce his wife. A woman couldn't, no matter what. So they elope, and I put quotation marks around the word elope. They leave here, they go to Natchez, and come back several months later as Mr. and Mrs. Andrew Jackson.
Oh, okay.
Though there hasn't been a clear document found of a marriage license, but common law marriage was common back then, and this was the edge of the frontier. So about 2 years later, word reaches Nashville that in fact her first husband had not divorced her.
Oh,
He had
the
done step
controversy.
one. It was a two-step process. He did step one, but not step two. So then he had grounds to divorce her, which he did. And so they married a second time here in Nashville, so everyone saw it. But this beginning dogged them for the rest of their lives. And Jackson believed it was what led to her death, that she became a political football in the election of 1828. And there were scathing articles and pamphlets written about her, and how could you elect this immoral man to the White House? And she died, as I described, and Jackson to his dying day never forgave John Quincy Adams and his supporters, because he believed that they had killed his wife.
You talk about this, and I just think about the election that's happening right now and the scuttlebutt we just went through with Donald Trump's wife and Ted Cruz's wife.
Yes.
I think history just continues to repeat itself. Isn't that
Does.
true?
It does. And that election was as dirty as anything we could think of today within the context of the time. And again, going back to some of our earlier conversation, we have to think of these figures within the time period that they lived in.
For sure. And then adopted son, I want you to touch on that too, because this was kind of unusual, right?
Yes and no.
Oh, okay.
The Jacksons had been married for a number of years already and had not had children. We're not certain why, but they had not had children. So when they were 42 years old, they adopted the son of one of Rachel's brothers.
Okay.
He and his wife had several children, and then she had twins. And so they took one of the twins when he was 3 weeks old and adopted him and named him Andrew Jackson Jr. and raised him as their son. He knew that his aunt and uncle were his birth parents, and he knew his brother, his twin brother, and were close friends. It would have been...
That's an interesting relationship.
Odd,
Yes, exactly.
But here was this man who was going to be the inheritor of the Jackson estate, the son of the president. He marries a woman from a well-placed family in Philadelphia who comes here and becomes the mistress of the Hermitage. And Sarah Jackson lived there until 1887 and was very much the daughter to Andrew Jackson, took care of him in his declining years like a daughter would.
Very interesting. We're going to take a quick break because I want to save just a few minutes at the end so we can talk about things that are happening at the Hermitage as we look forward to the summer months, and so people can make plans. So let's take a quick break. Come on back with us and we'll tell you what's up at the Hermitage. Stay with us.